There are men who hunt for the meat, and men who hunt for the pelt and the money. But there is a rarer kind, the sort who ventures into the cold, because something in the world has gone wrong, and he intends to be the one to set it straight. Ransom Teague belonged to that last kind. This is the story of the winter he spent in Boggs Hollow, where the snow arrived early and departed late, and where, for the better part of 40 years, no trapper had been foolish enough to run a line. I want to tell it to you the way it was told to me. Slowly, because some things, if you rush them, slip out the side door before you ever get a proper look. So, settle in. A quick note before we begin. If this is the kind of story you'd like more of, I've put 10 of them into an audiobook, The Hollow Files, 5 hours, 10 counties, the same voice you're hearing right now. You'll find the link in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. And while you're down there, do me the small kindness of telling me where you're listening from tonight. A name, a county, a kitchen with the radio off and one lamp burning. I read them all. It means more than you'd think to know there are people out there in the dark, listening together. Now then, the story. It was the winter of 1891, in the high country where the ridges fold over one another like a man's knuckles, in a part of the mountains the maps of the day didn't much bother with. There was a settlement, if you could call it that, at the foot of the grade, where 2 wagon roads met at a sharp angle and a creek ran fast and brown under a plank bridge. They called the place Coker's Mill. Though the mill itself had burned in some year no one could agree on, leaving only a stone foundation and a wheel pit full of leaves. What it still had was a store. Verily Combs ran it. She was 50 for that winter, a wide, unhurried woman with iron, gray hair pinned so tight it pulled at the corners of her eyes, and hands that had cut more salt pork and counted out more nails than any man in that valley. She had married once and was in no particular hurry to find another, and she kept behind the counter a single barrel shotgun she'd never had occasion to use. Though more than one traveling drummer had decided against his cleverness on the strength of how she looked at it, Ransom Teague came down out of his own country to trade at her store maybe 4 times a year. He was 68, and he didn't look it, and did look it, both at once, the way old men of that hard life often do. Tall and gone a little stooped in the shoulders, like a tree that has spent its whole life leaning out of one particular wind. His beard was the color of wood smoke. His hands were not the soft, ruined hands of a man who works indoors and goes to fat. They were brown and cracked across the knuckles, and the first finger of his right hand bent a little sideways, where a wolf had taken it between its teeth, in the year of the deep freeze, and Ransom had not let go of the wolf. He wore a coat of greasy wool gone almost black, and under it a hunting shirt of buckskin, so old it had stopped being any color at all. On his feet, boots he had resoled himself with leather cut from a buffalo robe his own father had brought east. He smelled of tallow and cold smoke and the inside of a stovepipe, and verily Combs, who did not waste her good opinion, thought him about the only honest man left in the high country. It was the last week of October when he first heard the name. He'd come down with a season's worth of marten and a few good fox, and he was leaning on the counter while Verily weighed his lead and set out his coffee, when another man walked in. A younger man, sitting on a nail keg by the stove with his hat in his hands and a look on his face like a dog that has heard a noise under the porch. Orrin Gabe, 27, lean as a fence rail, with pale eyes and the kind of fair beard that never quite fills in, so he always looked like he'd missed a day shaving. He was a trapper too, or trying to be. He'd come up from downstate 3 winters, back with more ambition than sense, and he'd been working the lines on the far side of the gap. In country the older men had let go, doing tolerably well at it, but he was not doing well that day. He had a string of about a dozen traps. All good steel, he told Ransom, and 4 nights running, something had been at them, not robbing them exactly, but springing them. He'd set the trap, bait it careful, scent it, cover it the way you do, and in the morning the trap would be sprung, the jaws clamped shut on nothing, and laid out neat on top of the snow beside its own bed. Not flung, not dragged, laid out. The chain coiled sometimes, like a man might coil it. Had the bait? Ransom asked. Gone, said Gabe, every last bit. But here's the thing of it. He turned his hat around in his hands. There's tracks in around the set, plenty of them, but they don't go nowhere. Ransom didn't say anything for a while. Say that again, he said. They circled the set. The young man said. Round and round, like something walking a ring, and then they just stopped. Like whatever it was lifted up off the snow, and was gone. Now, Ransom Teague had spent better than 50 years reading the ground. He had cut the sign of every animal that walks or crawls or drags itself through those mountains. He had followed a wounded cougar 2 days through a blizzard. He knew the difference between a track and a story. And he knew that tracks do not stop. A thing that makes a track has to go somewhere. It comes from somewhere and goes to somewhere. And if the track ends, that only ever means one of 3 things. Either the wind has filled it in, or the light is fooling you, or you haven't looked hard enough. So he asked the young man where his lines were. And Gabe got a strange, tight look around the mouth. And he said a word Ransom hadn't heard spoken aloud in a long while. He said, Boggs Hollow. And behind the counter, Verily Combs set down the scoop she was holding very quietly and looked up. You're trapping Boggs Hollow, she said. It was not a question. The low end of it, said Gabe, like a man caught somewhere he'd been told to stay out of. Just the low end, the benches above the creek. There's marten in there thick as I ever saw, and nobody's worked it in. Nobody's worked it in 40 year. Verily said. And you'd do well to make it 41. Now I should tell you what Boggs Hollow was, because the name will mean nothing to you. And it meant a great deal to them. It was a long, narrow draw that ran back up between 2 ridges, into the highest, coldest, least traveled part of that country. A creek came down through it. Good water, good timber. The kind of place that ought by every right to have been settled and farmed, and trapped to the bone 2 generations back. And once, it nearly had been. There had been people in Boggs Hollow. A family by the name the place was named for, and a few others who had taken up land along the creek in the years before the war. A handful of cabins, a little burying ground on a knob above the water. They had cleared some bottom land and run some hogs in the mast, and by every account done about as well as anyone did up there. And then, in a span of about 2 years, somewhere in the early 1850s, they had all gone. Not died. Gone. Some left in daylight with their wagons loaded, and would not say why, and would not be argued with, and would never afterward speak the name of the place. Some, it was said, did not leave in any wagon at all, and were simply not there one morning. The cabin standing open, the fire cold, the stock in the lot, and the dog gone wild in the yard. There was one account older than the rest, and Verily Combs had it from her own grandmother, who had it from a woman who had been there. There had been, that last winter the place was lived in, a man up the hollow who would not be driven out. The others packed and went, and he stayed, out of pride, or stubbornness, or because the land was his, and a man does not leave his land for a noise in the dark. And through the worst of that winter, the few souls left below would hear him, of an evening, calling up the draw to the neighbors who had gone, calling them by name, the Boggs and the rest, calling and calling, as though he could not understand why no one answered. And then the account went. There came a night when the calling changed, when the voices that answered him out of the high hollow were the voices of the very people who had loaded their wagons and gone down the mountain weeks before. Their voices plain and warm, calling him up the draw to come and see, come and sit by the fire, come on up, it's only us. And the man who had been so lonesome all that winter, who had wanted nothing in the world but for the voices to come back, got up from his own cold hearth and went out into the dark toward them. And that was the last of him. So the woman told it to the grandmother, and the grandmother to Verily. And you may believe as much of it as suits you. But it is the reason, they say, that the people who left Boggs Hollow would never afterward say the name of the place. Not out of grief, but out of a deeper thing, because to say a name up in that country is to teach it to whatever is listening. And they had learned, those people, at a price exactly how good a listener the high hollow was. And from that time on, the high end of Boggs Hollow had a name no surveyor ever wrote down, and grown men who would walk all night through a snowstorm to fetch a doctor would not, for any sum, go up that draw past the old burying ground after dark. It's nothing but country, said Gabe, but his voice didn't have much in it. It's country. Verily Combs agreed, and so's a graveyard. You go on and trap your country, son, but you mark me. You keep to the low benches, and when the light starts to go, you come down out of there. You don't never let dark catch you above that creek. The young man laughed the way a man laughs, to put a thing behind him. Ransom Teague did not laugh. He was watching the snow start to come down past the window. The first real snow of the year. Fat and slow and silent, and he was thinking about tracks that go round and then stop. He bought his coffee and his lead, and a new file for his traps, and he went back up into his own country, and for 3 weeks he thought no more about Boggs Hollow than a man thinks about a door he has no plans to open. It was the 3rd week of November when Verily Combs's nephew came up the mountain on a mule to find him. The man Verily sent, a nephew of hers, kin to her late sister, a grown fellow who kept the store's accounts and minded the place when she was away, had been sent because Gabe had not come down. He had not come down in 9 days. He had told Verily the last time she saw him that he meant to pull his line out of Boggs Hollow before the hard cold set in and bring his catch down the 1st week of the month. And he had not come. And a man with traps in the ground does not just leave them. The long and short of it was that somebody had gone up to look. 3 men from the valley. They had ridden up to where Gabe kept a little camp at the mouth of the hollow. A lean-to, a fire ring, and a meat pole, and they had found it just as he'd left it. His blankets, his coffee pot, his spare boots dry by the dead fire. His dog half-starved, chained to a tree, and so wild with fear that it had worn the bark off the trunk turning circles, and that snapped at the men so they could not get near it, and had, in the end, to cut the chain with an axe from a distance and let it run. The dog ran down the mountain. It did not run up, and of Gabe they found one thing, and one thing only they found: his trap line. Every trap pulled up out of the ground and hung in order along about 200 yards of the creek, hung up in the low limbs of the trees, at the height of a man's head. Each one sprung shut on nothing, the whole string of them swaying a little in the wind like a line of wash. And at the end of the line, the last trap, and caught in its jaws, not an animal, a boot, just the one. And that was where the 3 men from the valley had stopped looking and turned their horses and come down. and one of them had taken to his bed and not been right since. Verily Combs did not send for the law, because the law in that country was a day and a half away and would not come up a mountain in November for a missing trapper. She sent for Ransom Teague because she knew him, and she knew that if there was a thing in those mountains that took men and hung their traps in trees and left a single boot, there was exactly one man living who would not turn his horse and come down. Now, here's where I have to be honest with you about what kind of man Ransom Teague was. Because if you think he went up there out of grief for a young fellow he'd met but the once, you haven't understood him. He went up because he was angry, not loud angry. He was not a loud man. He was the cold, slow, deep kind of angry that comes over certain old men when they meet, late in their lives. A thing that does not fit in the world they thought they understood. All his life, Ransom Teague had lived by a single proposition: that everything in those mountains, every track, every cry in the dark, every shadow at the edge of the firelight, had a cause that a patient man could find and name, and if it needed doing, kill. And here was a thing that hung a man's traps in the trees. He did not believe in the haunt of Boggs Hollow. He intended to go up there and find out what was really doing it, and put a stop to it, the way he had put a stop to the wolf and the cougar and every other thing that had ever come against him in 68 years. And if I am honest, I think the not believing was the most dangerous thing he carried up that mountain. More dangerous than the cold, more dangerous than his age. Because a man who is sure he cannot be afraid has left the door to fear standing wide open behind him, and does not know it. A breath here before what comes next. If this voice is one you'd want to spend more time with, I keep a longer collection. The Hollow Files. 10 cases, 5 hours. The same kind of quiet trouble I'm telling you about right now. The link is in the description below and pinned at the top of the comments. And if it's not too much to ask, take half a second to subscribe before you go on, so the next one finds you when the nights are long. This story is told by the fear behind you. If you're hearing it told anywhere else, in any other voice, then someone has taken it without leave, and you'd be doing me a kindness to let me know. Let's go back to the story. He went up the first week of December. He went alone, which was the only way he knew how to do anything, and he went in no hurry, because hurry in the high country in the cold is just another word for dying. He took a mule named January, a steady gray molly that had carried him a dozen winters, and feared nothing on God's earth. And on her back, he packed the things a man takes when he means to stay a while in a hard place: flour, salt meat and parched corn, a side of bacon, coffee, a bag of dried apples, his blankets and a buffalo robe, an axe and a hatchet, his traps, his bait, his lures, powder and ball and a tin of caps, a coil of good rope, and his guns. He carried too a long muzzle, loading rifle his father had carried before him, a heavy thing with a barrel as long as a man's leg, that he trusted past any other because it had never once in his life failed to do what he asked of it. And in a scabbard, a newer piece, a lever gun that held a magazine of cartridges he had bought off a dead man's estate 2 winters back, and did not entirely trust, the way old men do not trust new things, but that he brought along because it would speak many times fast, where the old rifle spoke once slow. The first day's ride was nothing. Cold and bright, the snow a foot deep on the level, and crusted hard enough to bear the mule on the open ground. He made the mouth of Boggs Hollow by the middle of the afternoon, and he found Orrin Gabe's old camp just as the men had described it. The lean-to with one wall fallen and now under the snow, the meat pole bare, the tree where the dog had been chained scarred white in a ring at the height of a frantic animal's reach. He did not camp there. He went up the hollow another mile past the low benches, where the young man had set his fatal line, up to where the creek ran out of a steeper, darker part of the draw, and there, on a flat shelf of ground with a rock wall at its back and the water close in front, he made his camp. He chose it the way a soldier chooses ground, wall behind him so nothing could come at his back, water in front, a clear field all around where the snow would show him any track that came in the night. He cut poles and made a half shelter and banked it with snow, and he built his fire against the rocks so the wall would throw the heat back at him. He picketed January on a long rope where he could see her from his blankets. And the first night, nothing happened. I want you to sit with that, because that is how it begins every time with the kind of thing that was in that hollow. Not with a scream in the dark, but with nothing. With one ordinary, peaceful, freezing cold night, so that in the morning a man tells himself he's been a fool and lets a little of his guard down, pours his coffee easy, and starts to think about where he'll set his traps. That first morning, Ransom Teague walked his ground. He went down to the low benches and looked at where Orrin Gabe had trapped. And he found the trees where the man's traps had hung, the mark still on the bark where the iron had rubbed. And he stood there a long while in the cold, reading what he could read. And what he could read was this: that whatever had done it had been strong, not strong like a bear is strong, in a lunging, tearing way, but strong in a patient way. The traps had been lifted and hung and arranged. There is no animal in those mountains, nor in any other, that arranges things. He set his own line that day 6 traps along the same benches, set the way 50 years had taught him, bedded and scented and covered, so that his own mother could have walked over one and never known. And he did one thing more, one thing Orrin Gabe in his youth had not thought to do, in the soft snow around each set, in a wide ring. He smoothed the surface flat with the back of his shovel, so that anything at all, that came to his traps in the night would have to leave its mark on ground as clean and blank as a page. Then he went back to his camp, and he ate, and he cleaned his guns, and when the light began to slide down off the high rim of the hollow, he banked his fire and sat with his back to the rock and the old long rifle across his knees, and he waited. The second night, it came to the edge of the firelight. He did not see it. He felt it first, the way you feel someone come into a room behind you. January felt it before he did. The mule that feared nothing came up off her doze all at once with her head high and her ears hard forward, staring out into the dark down the hollow, and she made a sound Ransom had never heard her make in a dozen years. A low, trembling sound, almost a moan, and she pulled back to the very end of her rope and stood there shaking. Ransom turned slow and looked where she was looking. There was nothing to see but the dark and the snow and the black wall of the timber. But the dark was wrong. I don't know any better way to say it than the way he said it years after to the one man he ever told the dark down the hollow was wrong. It had a weight to it. It had a tension in it. He had spent 10,000 nights in the woods, and he knew the ordinary dark the way you know your own bed. And this was not that. Something down there in the black was looking back at him, and had been perhaps for some time. He did not call out. He did not raise the gun. He sat very still and he waited. And after a while, a long while, long enough that the fire burned low and he did not feed it, the weight lifted. January's head came down. The dark went back to being only dark. And in that quiet, just at the edge of hearing, from somewhere up the hollow behind him, above his camp, he heard a sound. It was a sound he knew. The small, particular double click of a trap being sprung. the jaws coming up and over and snapping shut. But his traps were all below him on the benches down the hollow. And the sound had come from above. He was up before he knew it, on his feet with the rifle in his hands, his old heart going hard in his chest, staring up the black draw, where no trap of his was set, where no trap of anyone's had been set in 40 years. And out of that dark, faint and clear and unhurried, the sound came again, click, clack, a trap springing, and then another, further up, and another, a whole line of them, one after another, going away up into the high end of Boggs Hollow, the part no man went, springing in the dark in their proper order, like a thing counting itself off, until the last one, far away and faint, fell silent, and the hollow was as quiet as the inside of a grave. He sat the rest of that night with both guns loaded and his eyes open. And he watched the place down the hollow where the weight had been, and he listened to the place up the hollow where the springing had stopped. And he understood that he had set himself down, deliberate as you please, in the middle of a thing that had been waiting a very long time for company. He thought about Orrin Gabe. He thought about the young man sitting on the nail keg at Verily Combs's store, turning his hat in his hands, telling about tracks that went round and then stopped. And how the older men had let that country go, and how nobody had worked it in 40 years, and how the young fellow had heard of that the same as Ransom had, and had gone up anyway, because he was 27 and the marten were thick, and a man that age does not believe the world contains a thing he cannot handle. And Ransom thought, sitting there in the dark with his old heart going, that he was not so very different from the young man. After all, that he had come up the same draw on the same errand, sure in the same way that whatever was up there would prove in the end to be a thing he could find and name and kill. The only difference between them, he thought, was 68 years, and he was no longer certain that was a difference in his favor. He did not sleep that night. In the morning, he went up. Now understand, this is the thing no one had done. The 3 men from the valley had not gone up. Orrin Gabe, for all his foolishness, had kept to the low benches for 40 years. The unspoken rule of that country had been that you did not go up the high end of Boggs Hollow. And Ransom Teague, in the gray light of that third morning, with his rifle loaded and his anger cold and hard in him, broke the rule that everyone else had been too wise to break. He left January at the camp. He did not trust what was up there around the mule, and besides, the draw narrowed and steepened above the camp into a place no animal that size could go easy. He went on foot in his snowshoes, with the long rifle and a day's worth of caution, and he climbed up out of his camp into the high hollow. And he began to find things. The first thing he found, a quarter-mile up, was a tree, a big old hemlock, dead and gray, standing alone where the draw made a bend, and hung in its lower limbs at the height of a man's head were traps. Not his, older, rusted black, some of them ancient steel, the kind a man would have carried up that hollow 40, 50 years gone. A dozen of them, 2 dozen, more, hung in that one dead tree in their neat and dreadful order, sprung shut every one, swaying just slightly though there was no wind down in that sheltered draw. And under the tree, the snow was smooth and unmarked and clean as the day it fell. Nothing had walked to that tree. Nothing had walked away from it. The traps were simply there, as though they had always been there, as though the tree had grown them. Ransom Teague stood under that tree for a long time, and the thing he felt, he said later, was not fear, not yet, but a kind of vast and daunting wrongness. The feeling a man gets when a number he has added up 100 times comes out different, and he understands that either the whole world is wrong, or he is, and there is no third thing it can be. He went on up. He should not have. Every honest instinct in his body, the instincts that had kept him alive 68 years in country that killed careless men by the score, was telling him to turn around. But the anger was stronger than the instinct. And there was something else, too. Something he was ashamed of afterward, and only admitted to the one man he wanted to see it. After 50 years of knowing every single thing in his mountains, he had finally found a thing he did not know, and some deep, reckless part of him had to lay eyes on it, the way a man cannot help but look down off a high place, even as it turns his stomach. So he climbed. The hollow closed in, the walls drew together, and the timber grew thick and black. Old hemlock and laurel, so dense the snow barely reached the ground, so that he walked in a green, black gloom, even in the middle of the day. And the creek beside him ran down through it, making no sound at all, though he could see the water moving. That was the first thing that truly turned him cold, running water that made no sound. He stopped and crouched by it and put his bare hand down close, and he could feel the cold coming off it, see the current pulling at a strand of weed, and there was no sound, as if the water were behind glass, as if the whole high hollow had been wrapped in wool. And in that wool, wrapped silence, he began to hear the voice. It was far off at first, up ahead, up the draw, where the hollow ended at last against the foot of the high ridge. A man's voice, calling out the way a man calls when he is hurt or lost or caught in something. The words too far to make out, but the sound of them unmistakable. The rising, breaking, desperate sound of a man in trouble, calling for help. And the cold, reasonable part of Ransom Teague's mind said at once and very clearly, "Verve, that is Oren Gabe. He is alive. He's up there, caught in something. He's been 9 days, and that is why his camp was left and his traps were pulled. Some part of this has a plain and human explanation after all, and there is a young man dying up that draw while I stand here being afraid of the quiet." And he started forward, fast, calling out himself now, hold on, I'm coming." And he had gone 2 dozen steps up the draw toward that voice, before the part of him that was older than reason, the part that had let go of the wolf with its teeth in his hand, reached up and took hold of him and stopped him cold. Because he had heard the voice say a word, clear now, close enough to make out. The voice up the draw had broken off its wordless crying and called out, plain as day, a name. It had called Ransom, and Ransom Teague had not told one living soul his name in that hollow. He had not told Oren Gabe his name. He had spoken to the young man the once at the store, and verily had called him nothing. And there was no man, no animal, no honest thing in all that high country that could have stood up that draw in the wool, wrapped silence, and called him by his given name in the voice of a dying friend. He stood stock still, and up the draw the voice called it again, softer, almost tender, almost pleased, and for his ransom. And then a third time, and on the third time, it was not quite right. It was a hair too slow. It came out stretched, the vowels pulled long, like a voice played back at the wrong speed, like something that had heard a name spoken once, somewhere, somehow, and was practicing it, turning it over, trying it on Sir Ransom. And Ransom Teague, 68 years old, who had not run from a living thing in all his grown life, turned and walked back down that draw as fast as the snowshoes would carry him. Not running, because a man who runs in the deep snow falls, and a man who falls is finished, but walking with everything he had, his breath sawing in his chest, the long rifle clutched across him, and behind him, all the way down, the voice followed. Not the footsteps. He never once heard a footstep, just the voice keeping pace, neither gaining nor falling back, calling his name in that slow, stretched way, and laughing sometimes, a low sound that was learning to be a laugh, and once horribly, calling out in Verily Comms's voice, and once in a voice he had not heard in 30 years. The voice of his own dead wife, saying his name the way she used to say it of a winter evening. And that nearly finished him. That voice nearly turned him around, and I think if it had, he would not have come down out of Boggs Hollow at all. But he did not turn. He came down to his camp, where January stood lathered and wild-eyed at the end of her rope. And the voice stopped at the edge of the high hollow, the way the weight had stopped at the edge of his firelight, as though there were a line up there it could not, or would not cross. He stood in his camp shaking, an old man shaking like a green hand on his first hard night out. And up the dark draw, the silence settled back, patient waiting, and he understood then, finally and completely, the thing the whole valley had understood for 40 years, without ever once being able to say. There was something in the high end of Boggs Hollow. It was not an animal. It did not leave traps because it did not walk. It hung the traps because it had watched men set traps for 100 years. And it was, in its way, doing what it had seen done, the way a thing with no face of its own will wear the faces it has seen. It had no voice of its own, so it took the voices of the men who came. It had taken Orrin Gabe's voice. It would, given the chance, take his, and it was not going to let him simply walk away. Now, a wiser man, or only a less stubborn one, would have packed January that hour and gone down the mountain, and never come back, told Verily Comms there was nothing to be done, and lived out his days. And Ransom Teague stood in his camp, and looked up that draw and thought about doing exactly that, and could not, because of the anger, and because of one thing more, which he worked out sitting by his fire that night, with the lever gun across his knees. And the long rifle leaned against the rock, and both of them loaded, and his eyes never leaving the dark. The voice had stopped at the edge of the high hollow. The weight had stopped at the edge of his firelight. The thing, whatever it was, had a reach, and the reach had an edge. It could not, or did not, come down out of the high end of the draw. For 40 years it had stayed up there. And the people had stayed away, and the two of them had kept a kind of treaty. The living below, and the thing above. And the boundary of it was that old burying ground on the knob, the line no one crossed after dark. It was bound to that high hollow the way a dog is bound to its chain. And a thing on a chain, Ransom Teague thought, can be cornered. You only have to get it where the chain runs out. He spent 4 days getting ready. I'll not tell you he was calm. He was an old man alone in a freezing hollow, with a thing that wore his dead wife's voice, waiting up the draw, and he did not sleep more than an hour at a stretch the whole 4 days. And he aged in those 4 days in a way that the men in the valley remarked on when he finally came down. But he was not idle, and he was not afraid, and he made his plan the way he had made every plan of his hard life, which was slowly and from the ground up. And the thing did not leave him be while he made it. The first morning of the 4, he came out from his shelter to a cold gray light and found, in the smooth snow he kept clean around his own camp, the way he kept it clean around his traps, a single line of marks coming down out of the high hollow toward his fire, and stopping, neat and deliberate, just at the edge of where the firelight would have reached in the night. The marks of feet that were almost feet. They came down to the line of the light, and there they ended and turned. The way a man turns who has come as far as he is allowed and stands a while and looks. And then they went back the way they had come. It had walked the edge of its chain in the night. It had come down as far as it could come, to look at him sleeping, and gone back. The second morning, The marks were closer. Not past the line of the light, never past that, but closer to it, pressed deeper, as though the thing had stood there longer, or stood there straining. And that day, working up the draw with his loads of pitch pine, he heard it take a new voice, a voice it had not used before. And it took him a moment to place it, and when he placed it, the load nearly went out of his hands. It was January's voice, the mule's, making the low, trembling moan the mule had made that first night, the sound of an animal's pure animal fear. Only the thing up the draw was making it now, slow and soft, and almost like a question, trying it the way it tried everything. And down at the camp, the real January heard her own terror called back to her out of the dark, and went near mad on her rope, and Ransom had to leave his work and go down and stand with her with his hand on her neck a long while before she would be still. It was learning, all the 4 days. That was the thing he came to understand, and the thing that decided him, finally, that it could not be left. It was not a haunt, fixed and changeless, doing the same dead thing over and over the way a haunt does. It was learning him. Every night it came a little closer. Every day it took a little more. Given time, given winters enough, it would learn the whole of him. And the line at the burying ground would not hold a thing that had learned enough, the way no chain holds a dog that has had years to study the man who tied it. So he could not wait it out, and he could not walk away and leave it to learn the next man who wandered up the draw. He had to take it now, while he still had more of himself than it had got hold of. He made his plan the way he had made every plan of his hard life, slowly and from the ground up. First, he found the chain's far end. He went up the draw again. Yes, again. And this took more out of him than I can tell you. But he went in the high, cold light of midday, when the weight and the voice were thin and far. And he went only as far as he had to. And what he was looking for was the place where the hollow ended. Because a thing that is bound to a place is strongest at the center of it, and weakest at the edge. And he wanted to know the shape of the ground at the very top, where the draw ran out against the ridge. And he found it the high hollow ended, as he'd thought it would, against a great wall of broken rock at the foot of the ridge, where some old slide had brought half the mountain down in a tumble of gray stone furred with moss and ice. And in the face of that rock, behind a curtain of dead laurel, there was an opening. A black mouth in the stone, low and wide, the kind of place a bear might den, the kind of place that goes back into the mountain farther than any man has ever cared to follow. And around that opening, in the snow, for the first time in all of Boggs Hollow, there were tracks. Tracks going in, no tracks coming out. They were not the tracks of any animal he knew. They were not quite the tracks of a man. They were something the snow had been pressed into the rough shape of by something that did not have proper feet, but understood dimly that the things which came to this hollow left such marks, and was making them the way it made the voices, the way it hung the traps, pressing the idea of footprints into the snow at the mouth of its den. Practicing. That was the center of the chain. That black mouth in the rock was where the thing lived, or slept, or waited, or whatever it did in the long years between the men who wandered up its draw. And Ransom Teague stood at the edge of the dead laurel, looking at it in the failing light, and felt the cold settle into him in a new way, a final way. And he turned and went down to his camp and began that night to make the thing that would corner it. He made a fire, not a campfire, a trap. He had hunted his whole life by understanding what a creature wanted and giving it to it in a place of his choosing. The cogger wanted the bait. The wolf wanted the calf. And this thing, this faceless thing in the rock, this thing that had no shape and no voice of its own. What it wanted, he had finally understood, was him. It wanted the men who came up the draw. It wanted their voices and their faces and their warmth and their fear. It had wanted Orrin Gabe, and it had taken him. It wanted Ransom Teague, and had been calling him, patient as winter, up the draw toward its den for 4 days. So he would go. He would go up the draw the way it wanted, toward the mouth in the rock. But he would go on his terms, in his time, and he would not go to be taken. He cut and split a great quantity of pitch pine, the fat, resinous hardwood that burns hot and fast and bright, and he bound it into small piles, and over the last day and the last night he carried it, load by load, up the draw into the wool-wrapped silence, with the voice murmuring around him the whole way, calling him by his name and his wife's pet names, and once weeping in the voice of the young man Orrin Gabe. And he laid those piles of pitch pine in a line down the center of the high hollow, from the mouth in the rock, all the way down to the edge of the burying ground, the line the thing could not cross. He soaked them with the bear oil and the bacon grease and the lamp oil he had brought, every bit of it. And at the mouth in the rock, before the black opening, he built the largest pile of all, and into it he laid the last of his oil, and he laid his traps, all of them open and set and waiting in a ring around the front of the pile. Then he waited for dark. He waited at the bottom of the line, at the edge of the burying ground, with the long rifle and the lever gun and a lit pine knot in his hand, and his back to the safe and ordinary lower hollow. And when the last gray light slid off the rim and the dark came down into Boggs Hollow like water filling a well, he stepped across the line. He stepped up into the high hollow, into the thing's own country, alone in the dark. And he began to walk up the draw toward the den. And as he walked, he touched the lit pine knot to each pile of soaked pitch pine he passed, so that behind him as he climbed, a line of fire sprang up down the center of that black hollow, roaring and snapping and throwing a wild red light up into the hemlocks. A line of fire from the burying ground to the den. And Ransom Teague walked up the middle of it with a gun in each hand, and his dead wife's voice, calling him sweetly from the dark ahead, walking him in. I have thought a great deal about what happened up there, at the mouth of that den, in the firelight, in the dark, in the high end of Boggs Hollow that no living man had walked in 40 years. And the truth is, I cannot tell it to you whole, because Ransom Teague himself could not tell it whole. He told the one man he trusted, near the end of his life, and even then he could not put it in a straight line. The way you cannot put a dream in a straight line. He said the fire ran up the draw faster than he could climb. He said the voice ahead of him stopped being his wife's, and stopped being any voice at all, and became a sound he had no name for. A sound that the running water had been making all along under its glass silence. The sound the whole high hollow had been holding in for 40 years. He said the dark at the mouth of the rock did not run from the fire the way a dark ought to. He said it gathered. He said it came down off the rock face and out of the black opening, not as a shape, but as the absence of a shape. A hole in the firelight where the firelight should have been, and that it came at him low and fast across the snow, over the smoothed out snow where he had set his ring of traps. And the traps held it, or held something. He heard them go off, the whole ring of them, click, clack, click, clack. The sound he had heard in the dark that second night, the sound it had learned from men, used now against it. And he heard the great steel chain of his own iron drag and bite and catch. And the hole in the firelight thrashed and folded and made the sound the water made. And he raised the long rifle his father had carried, and he fired into the center of the dark, where no center was. The one slow shot the old gun always gave him. And he did not wait to see what it did, but dropped the rifle and took up the lever gun and emptied it. Every cartridge, fast. The way he had brought it along to do. Into the thrashing hole in the world at the mouth of the rock. And then he did the thing he had truly come to do. He took the last pine knot and the last of the oil, and he threw them into the great pile he had built across the mouth of the den. The pile his ring of traps was anchored to. And it went up all at once with a sound like a great indrawn breath. A wall of fire across the black opening in the rock sealing it. And whatever was in the traps was in the fire now, caught in his iron, anchored to the burning, unable to drag itself back into the dark of the den or out across the snow. And Ransom Teague stood in the red light with both guns empty and watched the thing he had cornered burn. He did not describe the burning. The one man he told asked him, and he would not. He said only that it took a long time, longer than a thing ought to, and that it made near the end. Every voice it had ever taken, one after another. All the lost men of Boggs Hollow, going back 100 years calling out of the fire, and his wife's voice among them, and the young man Oren Gabe's, and that the last voice it made, just before the end, just before the fire took it down to nothing, was his own voice calling his own name out of the flames, the way it had called him up the draw. And then it was gone, and there was only the fire burning down, and the snow and the silence, and an old man on his knees in the high end of Boggs Hollow, with 2 empty guns and his face turned away. He came down the mountain 4 days later. He came into Coker's mill on foot, leading January, who would not let him ride. And verily Combs, who saw him come across the plank bridge in the gray noonlight, said he looked like a man who had been gone a year, and not a month. White to the lips, his hands shaking so he could not at first lift the coffee she poured him. He told her it was done. He told her the hollow was clear, that a man could trap the high end now if he was fool enough to want to, and that nobody would. And that was as it should be. He did not tell her what he had seen. He did not tell anyone what he had seen, not for a long time, not until the very end. Of Oren Gabe, there was never any further trace. His people down the state were written to. His dog was never caught. For years afterward, men spoke of a half-wild dog that ran the ridges down below the gap and would not be approached and would not be killed. And let that be what you will. And the high end of Boggs Hollow stayed empty and stayed quiet, and the marten came back thick in there, thick as a man ever saw, and no man ever set a trap among them. And the line at the old burying ground held the way it had always held. Only now it held nothing in, because what had been bound up that draw was gone, burned out of the world by a stubborn old man who would not believe in it until it called him by his name. That should be the end of it. A clean end. The monster cornered, the monster burned, the hollow set free, the old hunter come home. But I told you at the start I'd tell it to you the way it was told to me. Slow and to the end. And there is one more thing. And it is the thing that the one man Ransom Teague trusted carried with him afterward and could never set down. And I will give it to you now, and let you do with it what you can. Ransom Teague lived 11 more years. He lived them quiet, down off the high country in a cabin near the foot of the grade, not far from Coker's mill. And he did not trap again. He kept a few hogs in a garden, and he came to Verily Combs's store of a Saturday and sat by the stove. And he grew very old, and at the end of it, in the winter, in his bed, with the one man he trusted sitting up with him through the long nights, he told the story I have told you. And he told one thing more. He said that every winter, in the deep of it, On the coldest, stillest nights, when the snow lay heavy and the world went quiet the way it goes quiet only in the high, cold dark, he would wake. Not from a dream. He would wake to the silence. To a silence that had a weight in it, and an attention in it. A silence he knew. The wool-wrapped silence of the high end of Boggs Hollow, settled now somehow into the corner of his own small room, a mile down from any mountain. And in that silence, faint and patient and unhurried, from somewhere just past the edge of the lamplight, in a voice that was almost his own and not quite. A hair too slow, the vowels pulled just a little too long, like something that had heard a name spoken once and was still. After all these years, turning it over and trying it on, he would hear it a ransom. He never saw anything. He was always alone in the room. But he came to believe in those last years that when a man corners a thing like that and burns it, he does not so much kill it as he takes it on, that it goes into the iron, and the iron was his, that it learned his voice best of all there, at the end in the fire, and carried that voice down out of the hollow inside him the way he had carried it up the draw inside its trap. And that one of these cold, deep winter nights, it would finish learning, and the voice it called with would be exactly his, with no hair of slowness left in it, no vowel pulled too long, and that on that night he would answer it. Because how does a man not answer his own voice, calling his own name out of the dark? He died on such a night. The man who sat with him said the room had gone very quiet near the end, the kind of quiet you could feel the weight of, and that the old man's eyes came open all at once and fixed on the dark corner past the lamp, the way January's ears had fixed all those years before on the dark down the hollow. And that Ransom Teague smiled a little, the way a man smiles when he hears a voice he has been waiting on a long time, and that he said, soft and easy, into the dark of the corner, one word. He said, coming, and then he was gone. So, that's the account of how one old trapper finally cornered the thing in Boggs Hollow, and what it cost him, and what, perhaps, came down out of those mountains inside him, and is up there yet in the high, cold, dark, or down here in some quiet room, in some corner past the lamp, learning a new voice, patient as winter, turning a name over and trying it on. I leave it with you. And I'll ask you the same question the one man carried out of that room and could never answer for himself. And I'd dearly like to read your answer in the comments tonight. When the cold and the quiet come down deep, and you wake to a wait in the dark, and you hear a voice past the edge of the lamplight that is almost, but not quite, your own, do you answer it? Tell me down below. Tell me where you're listening from, and whether you'd answer. And I'll be reading everyone. If you know a story like this one, and you'd be surprised how many of you do, leave it for me. It may be the next one I tell. The audiobook. The Hollow Files is waiting in the description and pinned up top in the comments. 10 of these to keep you company through the long nights, in the same voice you've been listening to all this while. Stay warm, keep a lamp lit, and if you hear your own name out of the dark some cold night this winter, be slow to answer.